fortunate today to have Dr. James Lewis discussing leadership with us. Dr. Lewis is very qualified to talk about this topic because he has just finished writing and recently publishing a book on leadership. Welcome, Jim. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, let me begin with some very basic questions, and then what we'll do is ramp them up and get into more detailed, tougher types of questions later on, as it were. So the most basic question I can think of is, what is leadership, and why is it important?
Okay. The definition of leadership that I've always liked the best came from Vance Packard years ago, in which he said that leadership appears to be the art of getting people to want to do something that you're convinced should be done. And in my mind, the operative word there is want. That is, getting people to want to do it. It's possible to get people to do things through coercion or threats or even the old carrot and stick reward sort of thing, but what you find in those cases is after the person has done what you want done, they may not have much motivation to continue. So real leadership tends instead to inspire people, to get them to want to do what needs to be done so that they're doing it willingly and through a commitment.
It's said that today we live in the age of management, and anyone who doubts this needs merely to go to a Borders bookstore or Barnes & Noble bookstore and go to the business section, and if they go to the business books, they're going to see that most of the business books are dealing with this topic called management. So a question I have for you, Jim, is there a difference between management and leadership?
Good question. Dr. Warren Bennis, who has been studying leadership and writing about it for probably 50 or 60 years now, has said somewhere that we have too many managers and not enough leaders, and I think he's right on target. If you go back to the history of the word management, originally it was a French word that had to do with training horses, and it meant evolved to mean the administrative part of doing the job. And of course, Dr. Peter Drucker is credited with having actually created the idea that management is a profession as opposed to just something that gets done in an organization. Now, is there a difference between managing and leading? Again, if you go back to the word lead, it means to get people to go along with. So instead of having to do with the administrative part of the job, which might consist of planning and budgeting and organizing and structuring an organization and those kinds of things, leadership actually has to do with the interaction between the person who's called the leader and the people. Again, getting them to want to do the things that are necessary for the success of the organization. And if you talk to people about how inspiring their jobs are, I'm afraid that the responses you get from people are not very encouraging. Many people see themselves as doing jobs that are not very exciting, not very inspiring, and it's the job of the leader to actually overcome that problem and get these people excited about what they do. That, to me, is one of the major differences.
Could you share with us a very short list, let's say, of people that you think in history are clear-cut leaders?
Yeah, I think President Kennedy is a person who almost everybody would agree was a natural leader. Whether or not they liked his politics or not, I think they would agree that he was a leader. Mahatma Gandhi was undoubtedly a leader. Winston Churchill during World War II was a leader, but not necessarily before or after that. And Rudolph Giuliani, mayor of New York, in the same way, post 9/11 became a leader, but I expect a lot of people would say that before 9/11 he wasn't necessarily such a great leader.
Now, a lot of these people you're mentioning seem to to be natural leaders, or they rose naturally to the challenges, which raises an interesting issue. Are you born to leadership? These names that you mentioned seem to be born to leadership. Are you born to leadership, or is it possible that you can, through the proper coaching and the proper effort, become a leader?
Well, I think there's sort of two parts to that question, or maybe two answers to that question. As I said, Winston Churchill was definitely a leader during World War II, but after the war was over, he actually was voted out of office. He was no longer effective as a leader. And in the same way, Mayor Giuliani was not perceived to be such a great leader before 9/11, but because of the events of 9/11 and how he handled them, he was then perceived as a true leader. So one of the things that we have learned about leadership is that there is a situational aspect to it that determines whether or not the person will be effective. In other words, a person may not be a leader in every single situation that they encounter. So there's a combination of the situation and the person. In addition, Kirsty talks about the fact that there are 4 skills, or 4 intelligences, he calls them, that each of us has in varying degrees. And he talks about these as being strategy, diplomacy, tactics, and logistics. Under certain situations, you need a leader who is very good at strategy. In other situations, you need a leader who has very good diplomacy skills, and so on. And it turns out that not all leaders will be effective across the board simply because the demands of the situation require one of those intelligences which they may not be very strong in. Along this line, though, some years ago I talked to a fellow who was a career military person, and he said that when he first went into the military, they didn't believe that you could teach people to be leaders. They thought if you weren't born a leader, that you would never be one. And he said, you'll notice that we spend a great deal of time and effort now trying to teach our officers to be leaders. And while we don't make all of them equal in their capability, we level the playing field a good bit. So my feeling is that all of us have the potential to be leaders for the most part, but it requires a certain combination of the person and the situation to actually bring out that talent and make them effective.
Now, the leaders that you've been discussing up till now have been, for the most part, leaders concerned with the public good. Whether you agree or disagree with their particular policies or approaches, fundamentally they were serving society and the public good. Is that a necessary condition for leaders? And a leader must basically do good.
No, at the very basic level, you have the everyday street gang in most cities, most major cities. Some of the kids that run those street gangs are definitely leaders. There's no question about it. But you certainly couldn't say that their purposes are good. The most notorious example of this, of course, is Adolf Hitler. As despicable as what he stood for might be, he was nevertheless a leader in the sense that he mobilized the whole population of Germany to start a major world war. And if I don't speak German well enough to really understand what he's saying, but if you watch a video, a film of Hitler in front of the masses of audience, he definitely had the ability to raise them to a frenzy almost. He was able to inspire these people to follow him in his quest for German supremacy. And interestingly, he was a pretty good psychologist in that he actually picked up on some of the concerns of the German people at that time. They were trying to recover from World War I. Their economy had been devastated, and like most people who are in pain, the Germans needed somebody to blame for their woes. I mean, otherwise you have to accept responsibility for it yourself, I guess. And so Hitler was able to say, it's the Jews, and play on that underlying current of discontent that was already in German society. In one of the biographies that I read about him, it's explained that he came to the realization one day that he could speak, that he could actually speak, that he could get people really excited about his ideas. Now, of course, there were people in German society who said, this guy is an absolute idiot. This guy is an absolute idiot. And there were quite a few people who understood he was extremely dangerous. The point, in fact, though, is that there was an element of German society that followed him willingly to do what he wanted done. And that, of course, is being a leader.
The examples of leaders that we've talked about to date have been examples taken from the world arena. These are very major players on the world stage. What does leadership mean at a more humble level? For example, let's say you're working on a project and you've been assigned to be a task leader. Is that term being used loosely, or is there really something that requires leadership to be a task leader?
Okay, let's talk truly humble. Watch a group of children play and notice that there will be oftentimes one child who is able to get all the rest of them to play whatever games he or she wants to play. They go along with this person. This person is exhibiting natural leadership. It's important to understand that leadership is behavior. It's not a position. It's behavior. And at any given time, any of us might be exercising leadership. Now, in terms of task leadership, when you're given an assignment and you're expected to get other people to help you carry it out. I remember one time, it was a class setting, but it was a very illustrative event for me. The instructor gave a group a problem to solve, and one of the fellows in the group said, as soon as he saw this, "Oh, I've seen this before." And so as I watched, everybody started looking to this fellow for help in trying to solve this problem. Well, the problem was he may have seen the problem before, but he couldn't remember how to solve it. And as soon as everybody realized that he didn't know how to solve it, they dropped him like a hot potato. So one of the things that groups are looking for in a leader is the ability to help them solve whatever problem, help them perform whatever task they're trying to perform. So task leadership is a very important component of the job, even when it's a fairly mundane sort of thing.
Now, if I could follow up on a point you made earlier, you made what I think to be an important point when you said leadership is not the position you occupy, it's your behavior. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, we loosely refer to our bosses as our leaders. Oh, I've got to consult with my leader on that. And yet, we all know that many of the people that hold official positions in organizations are not leaders under any stretch of the imagination. They don't inspire. They don't get people excited about their jobs. They don't know how to motivate them. And a part of it comes back to what we said earlier when we define leadership as the ability to get people to want to do what needs to be done. So ask yourself, how do you get people to want to do something? And to me, that boils down to the basic question of what's in it for me to do what you want me to do. And a good leader is able to help me achieve my objectives, meet my needs, at the same time that I'm helping the organization achieve its objectives and meet its needs. That's the mark of a good leader, is understanding what's in it for the follower. And this is something that James McGregor Burns talked a good deal about. He said, we have studied leadership almost exclusively without asking ourselves, what's important in the nature of followers for people to be good leaders? And so, again, if you have people whose needs can't be met by pursuing the task that needs to be done, it's not very likely that the act of leadership is going to be very effective at that time.
Well, I'd like to have a follow-up to a point you just raised right now. Again, I think it's an important point. And you said in your book, for example, that If you don't have any followers, you're not a leader. So I think having an understanding of the connection between leaders and followers is important if people are going to understand what leadership is all about. Okay, so what is the connection between leaders and followers?
David McClellan did research on the way leaders communicate and found that there was a very interesting distinction between those leaders who have been recorded by history as being really effective and those who have been recorded as being less effective. And he called this the I versus we communication approach. The leader who talks about I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to achieve this objective, I want to achieve that objective, is generally much less effective than the leader who predominantly uses the we communication motive. We can do this. We can achieve that objective, and together we can be stronger. John Kennedy is a perfect example of a president who used a lot of we terms compared to Richard Nixon, who, while a brilliant politician, was more inclined to talk about I. And so what this implies is that a really effective leader understands that there's a symbiotic relationship between himself or herself and the followers. Because, as I said earlier, unless the leader can help those people achieve their needs and their objectives, why should they go along with you?
I know from discussions I've had with you and from reading your works that you're a proponent of using various psychological tests to help people develop leadership skills. Can you share with us how, by taking some of these tests, as it were, or working with these instruments and analyzing the results, this can actually help someone improve his or her leadership skills?
Well, I think you have to begin with probably one of the best known statements of all time, which came from a Greek temple, I believe. "O man, know thyself." The basic premise being that until you understand yourself, it's difficult for you to understand other people. And unless you understand other people, how can you be really effective as a leader? It's an interesting thing that virtually all really effective leaders tend to have a keen understanding of others. I couldn't swear to you that they all understand themselves really well, but generally speaking, we find that those who do have better self-understanding tend to be more effective in dealing with other people. So the various instruments that I like to use help people understand some facet of themselves, and at the same time it helps them to understand how those attributes would affect their followers. For example, the Myers-Briggs is one of the most famous personality assessment instruments of all time. There's something like 1 million people in the United States who take that instrument every year. And the Myers-Briggs gives you 16 different personality types, which are defined by 4-letter codes. The problem I have with using the Myers-Briggs is 16 personality types is just too many for me to keep up with and use on a day-to-day basis. So David Keirsey, another psychologist, simplified this some years ago to 4 temperaments, he calls them. And it's much easier to keep up with 4 temperaments. They're a little bit more broad brush than the Myers-Briggs types, but they are much easier to work with. And each of those temperaments helps me to understand my tendencies as a leader, and also to understand how my interaction with followers would be affected by our personality differences. For example, we find that in the United States, something like 80% of the working population consists of just 2 temperaments. The SJ, which is called the guardian, and the NT, which is called the rational. Now, these 2 temperaments only make up about 50% of the population as a whole, but they make up 80% of corporate America, according to Keirsey's findings. Interestingly, he places these in a matrix, which shows that they are diagonally across from each other on the matrix, meaning that they have the greatest possibility for miscommunication and disagreement with each other. Now, that's 80% of our population in corporate America. And so if I understand that I'm an NT rational and I'm dealing with an SJ administrator or manager, we're going to have a very strong possibility of having conflict in our communication and so on. And I can therefore compensate for that if I know about it. By the same token, another instrument that I'm very fond of, in fact I'm a certified practitioner of it, is the Herrmann Brain Dominance Instrument, which I've always thought was a bad title, but Ned called it that. I told his daughter that it should be called the Herrmann Thinking Styles Instrument, and she agreed, but she said she was trying to stay in her dad's will before he passed away, so she couldn't change the name. But essentially, what Ned Herrmann had found was that we have different preferences for thinking in certain ways, and essentially these have to do with left brain thinking versus right brain thinking, left brain meaning more logical, analytical, and so on, and right brain being more interpersonal and conceptual and that sort of thing. And this is actually one of the dimensions in Kersey's grid where the communication style goes from abstract to concrete, left brain versus more right brain. Or I said it in reverse. The left brain would be the more concrete thinking, and the abstract would be the more holistic and ideas and so on. And of course, if you put a concrete thinker together with an abstract thinker, they have difficulty communicating. The concrete thinker says, you got your head way up here in the clouds, why don't you come down here to earth? And the other person's saying, why don't you get your feet off the ground once in a while and think outside the box? So that's a common sort of conflict between these people. Now, to the degree that I understand these things about myself, I can understand where other people are coming from, and I can deal much more effectively with them. So while the tests themselves aren't going to turn you into an instant leader, understanding yourself and others becomes a very important component of the whole thing.
Are there any other instruments that you use in your attempts to help people better understand themselves and become better leaders?
There are a number of other instruments. Daniel Goleman has made the term emotional intelligence quite popular in recent years, and Goleman's research has shown that those people who have the highest emotional intelligence tend to be the most effective at leading groups and organizations. I have not personally used any instruments to measure emotional intelligence, but I'm very much convinced that that could be a very useful thing to do. There's another model of leadership by Coos and Posner, which is called the Leadership Practices Inventory, and I have used that to help give leaders feedback on how well they embrace and follow the various practices that Coos and Posner have identified as being useful for leaders, and that's a useful instrument. Kersey and Blanchard years ago developed an instrument called the LEAD instrument, L-E-A-D, which looks at 4 different leadership styles and gives you some feeling for which of the 4 styles you prefer to use, and then of course helps you to understand how if you use the wrong style at the wrong time, you're not going to be very effective. So those are some other instruments that we do use.
So you definitely feel that people can develop leadership skills, but in life there are always trade-offs, at least that's been my experience, and I'm wondering, based on your work and your studies, your research, what have you found to be the limitations, the constraints in trying to develop leaders through these various processes that you employ?
Yeah, there's definitely limitations, David. I started my career as an engineer, and over the 20-some-odd years that I've been doing training and teaching seminars, I've taught quite a few technologists, engineers, programmers, scientists, and so on. And while it's easy to say that most people have the potential to be leaders, there are some limits. For example, the person who, for whatever reason, has almost no social skills. They don't know how to deal with other people effectively. They hardly know how to communicate. Generally speaking, they're not going to be very effective as leaders. That doesn't mean they'll be totally inept, but they won't be very effective. And in doing training, one of the things that I encounter constantly is the fact that when I do in-company training, there are people who are put in the class simply because I've given the company a flat rate for the training, and they want to get their maximum value for the money they're spending. So they put someone in the class hoping that maybe I can help that person. What they really mean is this person's broken and needs to be fixed, and they hope I can do that for them. And the person's sitting there like this, and the chances are that at the end of the 2 or 3 day session that we go through, they are not going to have learned much, other than the fact that they shouldn't have been there in the first place, which is probably obvious to everyone. So I like to say that if there's a real strong desire to be a better leader, most people can improve. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll be wonderful at it, but they can improve. If the person doesn't care about this stuff, doesn't want to do it, or has a handicap such as they have no idea how to communicate with other people or interact with other people, those people would require a great deal of work, much more work than most organizations would be willing to invest in order to try to get them to be leaders. Yet, I dare say that there is some situation somewhere in which virtually any of those people will emerge as a leader naturally under those special circumstances.
So it sounds like from a lot of your description of people who've done work in the leadership area, particularly, say, Daniel Goleman, there's a tremendous emphasis then on having decent interpersonal skills. How does the possession of interpersonal skills tie into leadership?
I've been working with a company for some time now, trying to help them do better project management and teamwork, and trying to teach some of their people how to be better supervisors. And the interesting thing is that virtually every employee in this organization has at least a bachelor's degree. And most of the population consists of master's and PhD people in the life sciences. And I think I can say without stretching it at all that the biggest single problem that exists in this organization is what we call people problems. And most of those come from the fact that people's egos get in the way of doing the job. They don't have really good interpersonal skills because they do tend to be of a scientific nature and not very people-oriented and so on. For example, recently the Vice President of Marketing simply said at a meeting that a particular product had not been working very well in the field, and that there was some problem with it. And the next, I guess that afternoon, the Vice President of Manufacturing wrote a scathing memo in the form of an email, which of course got broadcast to everybody in the company, saying that marketing was attacking them unfairly and unjustly, and that this was not acceptable, and he was really up in arms about this whole thing. And then the president of the company had to start doing damage control to smooth things over. I mean, after all, it was a simple statement of fact. It wasn't a personal attack, and yet that's how it came across to this Vice President of Manufacturing. So if you have those kinds of interpersonal skills issues in an organization, it requires some real diplomacy on the part of someone to help smooth over those kinds of situations. And to me, the interpersonal skills component does become a very, very important thing in being effective as a leader.
Well, what would you say then, as a follow-up to your story here, is the antithesis of leadership?
Oh, yeah, being extremely sensitive, hypersensitive, having a chip on your shoulder, always looking for slights and insults and things of that nature, being uncooperative. You can't be a good leader without also being a good follower. And what you find in many cases is that there are people who are totally unwilling to follow someone else. Those people are not going to make effective leaders unless you can get them out of that mindset.
Is there any evidence that having good leadership in organizations has bottom line impacts for those organizations?
Interestingly, that's always been one of the dilemmas. In the 20-some years I've been teaching, I have a lot of requests for me to teach the basic project planning, scheduling, and control course, which has to do with the tools of managing projects, for example. And I have far fewer requests for me to teach soft skills courses, those dealing with leadership and communication and so on. Daniel Goleman, in a book called Primal Leadership, recently reported that research has found that those leaders who have higher emotional intelligence return several 100% greater profitability to an organization than those who have lower emotional intelligence. In other words, this is one of the first times that anybody has been able to say there is definitely a direct bottom line result of being a good leader. Not just a nice, soft, touchy-feely result, but a bottom line result. So, yes, the more effective leader is going to tend to have better bottom line results for the organization, which after all is what it's mostly all about.
But don't we have examples in the history of business, and we have examples today of the heads of companies who are operating in quite an autocratic fashion and are still able to get good bottom line results. So is leadership really a requirement? I'm thinking specifically of Rupert Murdoch and his empire. Do you have a reaction to that, or is by the way Murdoch, although he's an autocrat, perhaps he's a good leader as well? How do you respond to that?
What you find is that you have to contrast the bottom line, the short-term bottom line result with the long-term impact of the organization. The quickest way to improve the profits of any organization is to immediately eliminate costs. Well, the quickest way to reduce costs is to lay off a bunch of people. Now, as long as those people are not producing direct product, that'll work. In other words, if I were to take, as one example, the Quasar plant that Motorola sold to the Japanese years and years ago, first thing the Japanese did was they laid off a whole slew of middle-level managers. Now, those middle-level managers weren't directly producing product that went out the back door, and so the salaries that they were being paid immediately went to the bottom line. Now, the problem you have is, over the long term, you may cripple the organization by doing these short-term, what I call surgical measures. And I would question whether or not that's leadership, basically because one of the most important things that a leader can do for an organization is to provide that organization with long-term vision. Where are we trying to go? What are we trying to be as an organization? What does it mean to work at this organization? And when you take only a short-term surgical approach to improve profitability, that generally doesn't have long-term lasting results.
Okay, I think you made a convincing argument that at the level, say, of the CEO or chairman of an organization, good leadership practice can contribute to the bottom line. Well, let's take a look now at the level of teams, something a lot lower than the CEO level. Does the practice of leadership at the team level make a difference to the organization's bottom line? And for that matter, are there special challenges that a team leader will face that aren't the kind of challenges that we think of when we talk about someone who's a president or a CEO of a company?
I think it's a good question. And I guess I would answer it this way. The teams tend to be where the rubber meets the road, as we say. John Carl Zahn, when he took over as chairman of SAS Airlines years ago, said the organization chart should be thought of as a triangle with him at the bottom, and the base, which what we normally think of as the base up here at the top. And he said the reason for that is everything I do should be done to support the work that these people do on the front line. And he called his book A Moment of Truth, and he said every interaction between a SAS employee and a customer is a moment of truth. And to the customer, that person is SAS Airlines. Okay? So when you get down to the team level, I forget who it was who coined the term the platinum rule, which is don't do to others the way they would have you do unto them, but do unto them the way they want to be done to. And another person who said you can't give good customer service with disgruntled employees. Now all of these people are saying where the rubber meets the road, it's really important that the people at that level be content, motivated, excited about what they're doing, driven to do a good job, and that requires someone to be a good leader to elicit those kinds of responses from those people. So I would say to you that, yes, down at the team level, team leadership becomes extremely important. Now, in a project context, one of the things you find is that the project manager often doesn't own the resources in the team. Those people report to other leaders, or other managers, I should say. And at that point, it becomes very important that a project manager be a project leader, because the only way you'll get anything done is through cooperation of these people. At another level, some years ago it was very popular to look at what are called self-directed work teams. And a lot of people call these leaderless teams. It's a misnomer. There's no such thing as a leaderless team. In every case where I talked to people who were in self-directed work teams that were functioning correctly, there was always a leader. The person may not be the official group leader, but they were the leader. And they were because they were able to set the context, the climate for the group, to provide them with vision, to get them excited about what they were doing, even in situations where the job itself was fairly mundane. So to me, if you think about the organization as an organism, unless every component of that organization is functioning well, at some point the organization suffers as a whole. It's sort of like if you have a diseased kidney, eventually it's going to poison the entire body. So it's very important that every team function better than just the average acceptable performance. They've got to go beyond that for an organization to really thrive and grow.
I'm curious to know what you feel, what you believe to be some common leadership mistakes that people can fall into. Now, I want to be clear here. By a leadership mistake, I'm not talking about people who are fundamentally just incapable of leading. Some of the people you described earlier, they just have, they totally lack empathetic skills. They're totally selfish. They won't follow other people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who's earnestly striving to be a leader, who perhaps has actually demonstrated very good leadership capabilities up to a particular moment in time. What kind of mistakes can they fall into that undoes a lot of what they've done?
Again, Coos and Posner talked about the need for a leader to have credibility with followers. And one of the ways that you can really lose it as a leader is to lose credibility. People in your team either catch you in a lie, or you make a mistake and you're not big enough to admit that you made a mistake, and they know you made a mistake, but you deny it, won't take responsibility for it. You lose credibility with them, you lose their trust, you lose their willingness to follow you. Not walking the talk, insisting to people that they should be doing one thing while you're doing something totally at odds with it. Again, you lose credibility with this. Those are some of the common mistakes that you see people make who are trying earnestly to be good leaders. And then, of course, just plain shooting yourself in the foot with an ill-timed comment, such as recently was made by Senator Lott, majority leader of the Senate, and a successful politician for years and years, and yet obviously very out of touch with the population, and making a very offensive remark that offended a lot of people, and he lost it right there. So those kinds of things are mistakes that leaders make that cost them, in many cases, their followership.
I want to pick up on a point you raised at the very outset of your presentation, and you pointed out that to a large extent leadership is defined situationally. That in certain situations people can rise to the occasion. When the situation changes, they're unable to cope with it. And you gave an example of a brilliant leader, Winston Churchill, who during World War II it's unimaginable that anyone could be a better leader than that. But within months of the war ending, the English people voted him out of office as quickly as they could. Now, we live in a world where change is the only constant. So we live in a world of dynamism, constant change, which means that the situations we face in our lives are continually changing. Does this mean then that leaders today can only be a leader for a very short period of time because they're not able to keep up with the changing situations, or can you still have enduring leadership in these chaotic times?
Well, I think part of the answer to the question lies in the way you asked it. Can the person change with the situation? What you see in corporations quite often is a person who is really, really effective at a certain organization gets recruited by another organization that's in trouble. And they recruit this individual because they think that he or she is going to turn them around. They're going to take them out of the doldrums and lead them to great things. And that person falls completely on their face in the new situation. For some reason, they weren't able to adapt a style of leadership that was appropriate for that particular situation, that particular group of followers, and they may very well not have been able to click with that group of followers. That's the other part of it. As we said, you're not a leader unless you have followers, and people are not going to follow you unless they perceive that you're going someplace they want to go. It's like the old "why the chicken cross the road" jokes that are so abundant. There was something on the other side the chicken wanted. And I think if a person, as a leader, doesn't understand that there's something on the other side of the road that the people want, and help them see that he or she can help them get it, then they're not going to follow with them. So, to a certain degree, what you're asking is about adaptability and flexibility. There's a cybernetician in England named Stafford Beer who talks about the law of requisite variety, and he says, in any system of humans or machines, the element in the system that has the greatest flexibility in its behavior will control the system. Now, what that leads you to understand is that as a leader, unless you have the flexibility to adapt to the situation and exhibit the kind of behavior that's needed for that situation, you won't be in control. And whether you like to think about it or not, leaders do control in the sense of getting people to go the direction they want them to go in, because left to themselves, people will be going other directions. So that is a control issue, not the control in the old command and control meaning of the word, but in the sense of influence, which is what leadership really amounts to. So I do think that there are leaders who are not very adaptable. If you move them from one situation to another, they're going to fall on their faces. There are also leaders who show great adaptability. You could move them from one situation to another and they'd be equally effective in both. But it's that adaptability. And I'm not sure that we can totally measure that. We do know that high levels of authoritarianism are negatively correlated with adaptability. That is, very, very authoritarian people tend not to be extremely adaptable. Now, if you put a person who's very authoritarian in a disaster situation, which requires essentially a command and control leadership style, they're going to be effective. If you put them in a less traumatic kind of a setting where command and control isn't required, probably they're going to have a great deal of resistance in their followers. They're not going to be very effective.
Now, when you reflect back on the thought and study you've given to leadership over the years, can you share with us, are there 2 or 3 outstanding features that you think characterize leadership? I mean, what's really impressed you about leaders and leadership as a consequence of your working in this area?
Yeah, about a year ago I wrote a book based on the principles that Alan Mulally espouses for leading an organization. Alan Mulally is the president and CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes, and he was the project leader on the 777 airplane when it was first developed. And I got a chance to interview him, and he shared with me his principles, which subsequently I wrote about in a book called Working Together. One of the first principles that Alan says must be in place for a leader to be effective is what he calls beginning with a compelling vision. And as I look at all the people who to me represent good leaders, all of them had a compelling vision. Probably the most famous of all speeches ever made in the 20th century was Martin Luther King's speech, I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a vision. This is where I think we should go. This is such a central component of leadership that, as you may recall, there's an old proverb that says, without vision, the people perish. And that's like 2,500 years old, all right? If you go out and you look at sites like Stonehenge, and you look at the Maya pyramids, and you look at the Egyptian pyramids, and all those kinds of things, you ask yourself, how in the world did someone get all those people to work so hard to build those edifices? And recent research in archaeology has demonstrated conclusively that it can't be explained through the term slavery. These people weren't slaves. They did this voluntarily. And again, remember, leadership is the act of getting people to want to do something that you think should be done. These people were able to get these folks to want to do this, to love stones that weighed as much as a modern-day locomotive, move those things from the quarry and put them in place. I mean, this superhuman effort, that's leadership. You look at Gandhi. His vision was to free India through non-violent resistance. Churchill, when he gave his famous speech about the only thing to fear is fear itself, he's telling the British people, again, the we motive, we're going to come through this. We're going to survive. We can do it. If you look at Giuliani, right after 9/11, we're going to survive this catastrophe, and we're going to be stronger in doing it. These people are able to give you a sense of, they know where you're going, they're going to help you get there, and we together can do it. To me, this is really what it's all about. And a leader that doesn't have vision isn't going to be a leader. They may be a manager, but they're not going to be a leader.
Jim, I'd like to thank you for the presentation you've done today, and for giving us this time to be able to interview you. I think your insights have been very interesting and stimulating. We're not completely done yet. I do have one final question, which is rooted in the fact that I, like you, have been a teacher for a long time. I've been teaching for 25 years. And you've taught a lot of leadership to a lot of people, both in corporations and in other scenarios as well. I'm curious to know, what do you think the motivation is of people who study leadership? You've met many students. Why do people study leadership?
You saved the best question for last, David. On the positive side, I think there are people who have a true vision for what they think could be accomplished in a team or an organization, and they'd like the opportunity to, shall we say, put their stamp on things, to get done what they would like to see done. That's true leadership, because these people are, in general, going to try to accomplish things that are going to be for the good of the entire organization. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a cynic in me, too. Peter Drucker wrote back in 1973 a book called Management, Tasks, Responsibilities, and Practices. Somewhere in that book, he makes the comment that much of what we call management consists of trying to essentially manipulate people. He doesn't use these exact words, but that's his message. And manipulation, in its true sense, is an attempt to get people to do something that's not necessarily in their best interest to do. It's an unequal exchange proposition where, after a while, people realize that they are being taken advantage of, that the return for their investment is not proportionate to what it should be, or not equal to what it should be, so they're not getting a very good outcome in the organization. And ultimately, if you practice manipulation over a long period of time, people begin to resent you, they begin to avoid you, and your role as leader becomes totally ineffective. You aren't able to get people to do what you want done simply because they resist you. So I think that it's very important for anybody who's listening to this interview, watching this interview, to understand the difference between leadership and manipulation. Leadership always takes into account the needs of the follower, and manipulation takes into account the needs of the leader only, and that ultimately fails.
Well, again, thank you very much, Jim, for the time you've given us, and I have enjoyed this interview thoroughly.
Thank you, David.